Do you ever struggle with feeling like your art isn't good enough for you to take time making it? Are you afraid of what others will think? Does that keep you from making art? This week we'll talk a little bit about how an art journal is a perfect solution for that, a safe place for you to express yourself and experiment without fear of what others will think. And we'll experiment with a fun 3D effect. Let's make some art because we are better with art. It's another watercolor week. I'm better with art. I have a pen and a small paintbrush. Although I won't be using it, I thought the dried paint in the lid paint tray would be a good way to show you how you can reactivate your leftover paint after a project. Just add some water and you can paint with it. This was left over from the very fun watercolor bubbles, and I will link to that video in the description in case you missed it. Welcome to Better with Art. I'm Melinda, and I'm here to encourage you to reclaim your creativity and practice creative self-care with weekly small art prompts that can be done in an art journal or on paper if you don't have one. We are not starting with our paint this week, but our pen, making the top edge of our map. To create our folds, we will draw lines down our page from each peak and valley. We want our lines to be roughly the same length, but not straight down. In order to create the 3D effect we're going for, you'll want your first line to be angled out toward the edge of your page. Then as you work your way across toward the middle of your page, that one will be more straight, and then start working your way back out. Then we will connect the bottom of each of our fold lines with the bottom line of our map. As you can see, I goofed up a line and decided to just leave it. This is my first time doing this experiment, and it's my art journal. My art journal is not a place to strive for perfection or an arbitrary standard of good. It's to experiment and express myself and get lost in the process. The second step of this one was creating a border. Next is adding some interesting shapes, which will become the land in my map. No rules for how these should look. Just have some fun, draw some shapes. After shape comes color. The first color is my border. I wanted to create an aged paper look, so I'm starting with some yellow and some brown. You want your first color to be quite light. I found this to be a little too yellow, so I decided to use the trick we have done several times in Better with Art and the 52-week art journal journey by mixing a color with its complement to tone it down. Purple is the complement of yellow, but as you could see in the tray, it went a little too purple. So I added more yellow, which led me to add also more brown. This is not watered down enough. At least it didn't seem to be. I'm sorry you can't see where I was testing it, but yes, I did have to add some water and more water. We want our first paper color to be quite light. As we go through our project of using our 3 different colors for our paper border, our land, and our water, we will be starting with a lighter shade or tint. Maybe the correct word would be hue. I'm not sure at this point. I'm beyond tired. But I do know that a tint is made by adding white and a shade is made by adding black, and we're not doing either of those things, and a hue is, well, it's a color. Regardless, we want our first go with our paper color to be quite light. We want to paint all the way around, and this again is a good watercolor project with which to have a hairdryer or a heat tool to allow things to dry between each layer. The other option, of course, is time. The option I used to use almost all the time. Layer 1 of my map paper is done, and it's time to make it dry. The second step to complete my border is to go over every other section with the same color but a little darker. Conveniently, I already have that. In subsequent steps, I'll be adding more pigment. The problem here was too much water. By dipping my brush in the water before picking up my paint, I was making both my brush and my paper too wet. I will speed things up here. But you can see, as I said, I'm painting every other section with the darker brown. This will give the impression, the illusion of shadows. Our light would be hitting our map from the left, leaving the right in shadow. We're creating depth with watercolor layers, similarly to how we did a few weeks ago. And we can use this concept of using deeper tones to create depth in other types of artwork. And you are about to see me make another error in judgment. I went ahead and started my blue without drying my second layer of border. What I did do correctly was start light, but my wet paint started bleeding into my wet paint. I did remember to blot the excess water off of my brush before I started back with the blue, of which I had started with far too little and had to rectify that. Trying to be careful, I had the same pale tone. As with the border, our first layer goes over the entire surface of that area. All of my water will be painted with the light blue before I create my shadows. As I always say early in my Better with Art videos, the art I share can be done in an art journal or on paper. A watercolor project is better done on something like a cardstock than a printer paper if you don't have watercolor paper. And if you don't have an art journal and are using paper, I do suggest you get a folder or make a folder with your paper so you can benefit from that privacy, that safety of having a safe place to express yourself and experiment and practice and learn without fear of what others will think. I have added a bit more of my blue to create a darker tone, and again am only painting on every other section. After having first dried the first layer, make sure that every other section you paint with your darker tone is the same section you previously painted with your darker tone. It seems the further I go, the more obvious how imperfect my lines are becomes, but that's okay. The next step is the same process with our land in green. First, we paint all of it with an even light-colored layer. That last layer, my blue shadowed water layer, air dried, because I had to go to work. One of the useful things about Better with Art small art prompts is they can be done even if you only have a few minutes at a time. You don't need a lot of spare time to practice creative self-care, and you don't need to spend a lot of money to reclaim your creativity, which is why I use inexpensive sets of watercolors in my videos. You can find a link to this one, as well as the pen I used and my favorite art journals for Better with Art journaling in the description. Time and money don't need to be insurmountable barriers between you and a healthy, creative self-care art-making practice. And neither does fear of what others will think. Your art journal is as private as you want it to be. You never have to show anyone. I share my imperfect art journal art to encourage you to embrace making perfectly imperfect art. Art doesn't need to be a masterpiece to have value. Better with Art isn't so much about the art we produce on the page, but the process of creating it. Even when I share a technique like this that does require certain things to be done in a particular way to create the desired effect, it's not about creating the perfect impression of shadows with watercolor as much as it is about playing with our art supplies to learn and learning to play with our art supplies. If your lines are, as mine, on the wonky side, that's okay. Your art journal should be free from your judgment too. Your journal doesn't care whether or not you can draw a straight line or if you get too much or too little color in your water. What it does is provide space for you to relax and unwind in lines and color, and the opportunity to find that wonderful state of flow where the noise around and inside quiets. And if you are, as I was, afraid you're wasting your time making art, that there are too many other more important things to do, the positive impact art making can have on your mental health is vitally important. It's never pointless to make art, even if it's art you know no one will ever see. Thanks for the opportunity to remind you of that. Making art is not a waste of time. If this video is encouraging you to take some time to make art, give me a thumbs up. And if you'd like a weekly reminder of that from me, be sure to subscribe. Feel free to share with others you know need to be reminded too. For journaling this week, imagine your art journal as a sanctuary, as it is. What does it feel like to have a place where no one judges you? You don't need a map to find it, just an art journal page or a piece of paper and some simple art supplies. Crayons and colored pencils would both work great for this process too, using lighter and heavier pressure instead of different amounts of pigment and water. The tricky part to find is the willingness to let go of the urge to criticize yourself and what you do. The last step of our 3D map creation is using a small amount of black in a significant amount of water comparatively to create a shadow. One way to approach this week's art journaling is to use your map to map things that make you feel emotionally secure. What could you lean into to let go of judging yourself so harshly?